June 5, 1944. Normandy coast, German 7th Army headquarters near Saint-Lô, France. The rain had finally stopped, but the wind still pressed against the windows of the stone command building like a restless hand. Inside, a single desk lamp illuminated a map table covered with colored pins. General Major Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the German 7th Army sector, leaned over the map with tired eyes. For weeks the staff had expected an Allied invasion somewhere along the French coast. Yet the weather had been terrible, low clouds, heavy seas, strong winds. Surely, not tonight. A young signals officer stepped in, boots wet from the courtyard. Her general, patrol reports from the Cotentin Peninsula say aircraft engines were heard over the channel. Dahlmann didn't even look up, probably reconnaissance. The Americans have been doing it for months. Outside, the night felt heavy and strangely quiet, but hundreds of kilometers away across the English Channel, that silence was about to shatter. High above the dark water, a massive armada of aircraft droned through the clouds. The sky was filled with the steady roar of engines, C-47 Skytrans, the workhorse transport planes of the Allied airborne forces. Inside one of them, the red jump light bathed the cramped fuselage in a dim glow. Private James Jimmy Walker, 20 years old, of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, gripped the static line clipped to the overhead cable. The aircraft vibrated so violently his teeth chattered. Across from him sat men carrying M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and demolition packs strapped to their chests. Nobody spoke. The aircraft commander's voice came through the intercom. 2 minutes. The paratroopers checked their gear again, helmet straps tightened, reserve chutes tapped, weapons secured. Walker tried to swallow but his throat was dry. The man beside him, Sergeant Joe Ramirez, leaned close. Remember the plan, kid? We hit the ground, find the rally point, and take that damn causeway. Walker nodded, though he could barely hear over the engines. Below them, the coast of Normandy slowly emerged through breaks in the cloud cover, dark farmland, hedgerows, and narrow roads stretching inland from Utah Beach. What the German commanders did not yet realize was that more than 13,000 American paratroopers and nearly 7,000 British airborne troops were already crossing the channel. Their mission was simple in theory: drop behind German lines, seize bridges, block reinforcements, create chaos. Back in the German headquarters near Saint-Lô, the first strange reports began arriving shortly after midnight. A telephone rang sharply. Hauptmann Weber speaking. A voice crackled through the line. Aircraft, many aircraft, flying low inland from the coast. Weber frowned. How many? A pause. Too many to count. Weber covered the receiver and looked toward Dahlmann. Her general, our radar stations are reporting large formations crossing the coast. Dahlmann straightened slowly. Bombers? No, sir. Transport aircraft. For the first time that night, the general's expression changed. Transport aircraft meant only one thing: airborne troops. Before he could reply, another phone began ringing, then another. Messages poured in from Corentin, Saint-Miraglisse, and dozens of small villages scattered across the Norman countryside. Flashes of parachute flares lit the sky. Anti-aircraft guns began firing wildly into the darkness. German soldiers stared upward in disbelief as hundreds of parachutes blossomed against the moonlit clouds. Some landed in fields, some in orchards, some directly among German defensive positions. The night air filled with shouting in English. A panicked corporal from a coastal unit reported over the radio, enemy paratroopers are landing everywhere. We cannot determine their numbers. Inside the headquarters, Dahlmann stared at the map. Utah Beach, the Cotentin Peninsula, key roads. Bridges. It was suddenly clear. The invasion had begun, but something else troubled him. The reports were inconsistent. Some units claimed dozens of paratroopers had landed nearby. Others insisted hundreds were attacking. A battalion near Saint-Miraglisse reported fighting in 3 separate directions at once. Dahlmann looked up at his staff. How is that possible? No one had an answer. What they did not yet understand was that the airborne drops were scattered across miles of countryside. Aircraft had been thrown off course by heavy anti-aircraft fire and thick clouds. Instead of neat formations, paratroopers were landing in small groups, sometimes alone. But that chaos was about to produce an unexpected effect. To the Germans, it would appear as though Allied soldiers were materializing everywhere at once. Inside the C-47 above Normandy, the jump light suddenly turned green. Go! 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 Paratroopers surged toward the open door, wind exploded into the cabin. One after another, the men disappeared into the darkness. Private Walker stepped forward. For a moment, he saw nothing but black sky and distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire. Then he jumped. The roar of the aircraft vanished instantly. Only wind rushed past his ears. Below him, Normandy unfolded like a shadowed maze of hedgerows and fields. His parachute snapped open, and in that silent moment, drifting toward enemy territory, he realized something terrifying, that he had no idea where he had landed, neither did thousands of others, and somewhere on the ground below, German commanders were about to experience the most confusing night of the entire invasion. June 6, 1944. 0:48 hours. Fields outside Saint-Mihiel, Normandy. Private James Walker hit the ground harder than he expected. The impact knocked the air from his lungs as he tumbled through tall grass. His parachute collapsed around him like a white ghost in the darkness. For a moment he lay still, listening. Distant machine gun bursts rattled across the countryside. Anti-aircraft guns continued firing somewhere near the coast. Above him, the sky roared with engines as more C-47 Skitran transports thundered overhead. Walker scrambled to his feet and dragged the parachute into a hedge, trying to hide the bright fabric. Ramirez, he whispered into the night. No answer. He was alone. Across Normandy, thousands of similar landings were happening at that exact moment, but almost none were going according to plan. Heavy clouds had scattered the airborne formations. German flak batteries forced many pilots to maneuver violently. Some transports dropped their troops too early. Others too late. Entire companies landed miles from their designated zones. Some paratroopers landed in flooded fields deliberately created by German engineers to slow any invasion. Men drowned under the weight of their gear before they could cut themselves free. Yet despite the chaos, small groups began forming in the darkness. Training took over. Find other paratroopers, locate weapons containers, move toward objectives. Inside the town of Saint-Mihiel, a fire was already burning in the center of the square. Earlier that night, an Allied bombing run had ignited a building near the church. German soldiers and local firefighters were struggling to control the flames. The orange glow lit the sky. Then someone looked up. Shapes were drifting down through the firelight. At first they thought it was debris. Then a German soldier shouted, "Fallschirmjäger! Paratroopers!" The alarm spread instantly. Rifles cracked, machine guns opened fire. Several American paratroopers descending into the town were shot before they even touched the ground. One of them, Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, caught his parachute on the church steeple, dangling helplessly above the square. He could do nothing but remain still and pretend to be dead while German soldiers searched below. The invasion had truly begun. Several kilometers away, Lieutenant Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne Division gathered a handful of scattered men along a hedgerow. The group was a mix of soldiers from different companies, some he had never met. "How many do we have?" Winters asked quietly. A corporal counted, 12, sir. They were supposed to be part of a company of more than 100. Winters checked his compass. Their objective was a German artillery battery firing toward Utah Beach. If those guns stayed active, the amphibious landings at dawn could suffer heavy losses. Winters looked at the men. "We're going after those guns." No one argued. Meanwhile, German commanders were receiving increasingly frantic reports. At the headquarters of the 91st Air Landing Division, officers crowded around field telephones. Herr Oberst, enemy paratroopers reported near Picoville. Another officer interrupted. New report from Chef Dupont, enemy troops attacking road checkpoints. A third voice cut in from another line. Contact lost with a company near Saint-Mihiel. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, a veteran paratrooper himself, listened carefully. Something about the reports bothered him. They were too widespread, too sudden. He pointed at the map. "These sightings, they cover nearly the entire peninsula." One officer frowned. "You think it's a diversion?" Von der Heydt shook his head slowly. "No. I think they are trying to paralyze us." And in many ways, it was working. Back in the dark Norman fields, Walker heard footsteps approaching. He raised his M1 Garand, heart pounding. A voice whispered urgently, "Easy. Easy. American. Two figures emerged from the hedgerow, Sergeant Ramirez and another paratrooper. Walker exhaled in relief. "Thought I lost you." Ramirez grinned. "Kid, everybody's lost tonight." The three men crouched together. "Anyone know where we are?" Walker asked. The other paratrooper shook his head. "Somewhere south of the drop zone. I think." Ramirez studied the sky. More parachutes were still descending in the distance. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Wherever we are, the Germans are probably just as confused." He was right. German units were beginning to report strange encounters. A patrol might engage 5 paratroopers in one hedgerow, then a kilometer away, another patrol reported 20 more, then another sighting somewhere else entirely. Officers began to imagine entire airborne divisions surrounding them. In reality, many of the American and British paratroopers were operating in groups of fewer than 10. But they moved quickly. They sabotaged telephone lines, ambushed supply trucks, blew up road signs. Every action multiplied the confusion. To German commanders studying their maps in the early hours of June 6, it seemed as though enemy soldiers had appeared out of thin air, behind every road, behind every village, behind every defensive position. June 6, 1944. 2:10 hours. German command post near Carentan, Normandy. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool uniforms. Maps covered the long wooden table, now cluttered with hastily written situation reports. Major Kurt Reinhardt, operations officer of the 91st Air Landing Division, stared at the latest message just delivered by motorcycle courier. He read it once, then again. Enemy paratroopers attacking crossroads west of St. Mireglise. He dropped the paper on the table in frustration. "That is the third report from that same sector," he muttered. Across from him, a communications lieutenant shook his head. "It cannot be the same unit, Herr Major. Another patrol reported enemy troops north of there only 20 minutes ago." Reinhardt ran a hand through his hair. "That would mean," he hesitated, "that they are behind every position we have." No one in the room spoke, because that was exactly what it felt like. Across the Norman countryside, the battlefield had dissolved into a maze of sudden encounters. A German convoy moving along a narrow road suddenly came under fire from a hedgerow. A machine gun burst erupted, then vanished. Moments later, the attackers disappeared into the darkness. Elsewhere, a small group of paratroopers cut telephone lines connecting German headquarters to frontline units. In another field, engineers from the 82nd Airborne Division planted explosives on a small bridge, blowing it apart before reinforcements could cross. The operations were small, sometimes only 5 or 6 men, but the effect multiplied rapidly. German units began losing communication with one another. Orders were delayed, reports contradicted each other, and the night seemed alive with unseen enemies. Near a narrow dirt road south of St. Mireglise, Lieutenant Richard Winters and his small group moved cautiously through the hedgerows. The thick Norman bocage created walls of earth and tangled vegetation nearly 2 meters high. It was perfect cover for ambushes. Winters raised his hand. The men froze. Up ahead, faint voices spoke German. A small artillery battery was positioned along a field edge. For 105 mm howitzers aimed toward the distant coastline, toward Utah Beach, where thousands of American soldiers would soon land. A few German sentries paced near the guns. Winters studied the position carefully. "We take them one at a time," he whispered. The men nodded. Despite being scattered and vastly outnumbered, they prepared to attack. Elsewhere, Private James Walker and Sergeant Joe Ramirez had joined 3 more paratroopers moving along a flooded pasture. Water reached nearly to their knees. German engineers had deliberately flooded much of the lowland terrain to block airborne landings. Several parachutes hung from trees nearby like pale ghosts in the dark. Ramirez crouched beside a narrow road. "Listen." An engine approached. A German truck appeared, headlights dimmed. Walker felt his pulse hammering. Ramirez raised his Thompson submachine gun. Wait. The truck rolled closer. Then Ramirez fired. The burst shattered the silence. The driver slammed on the brakes as bullets tore through the windshield. The truck skidded sideways and crashed into a ditch. The Americans ran forward, quickly disarming the stunned German soldiers. The entire fight lasted less than 20 seconds. Walker looked at Ramirez. "Think they know we're here now?" Ramirez gave a tired smile. "Kid, they've known for hours." Back at the German divisional headquarters, the situation reports were becoming increasingly alarming. One officer read a new message aloud. "Enemy paratroopers sighted near Pont El Abbé." Another message followed immediately: enemy patrol attacking supply column near La Fère Bridge. Major Reinhardt slammed his fist on the table. This is impossible. He pointed to the map. That area alone covers nearly 30 kilometers. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt studied the reports quietly. Unlike many of the officers present, he understood airborne warfare. He had commanded German Fallschirmjäger earlier in the war. He knew exactly what small airborne units could accomplish. They do not need large numbers, he said calmly. They only need to appear everywhere. Several officers looked at him uneasily. Von der Heydt continued, the Americans are creating the illusion of a much larger force. A lieutenant asked nervously, so what should we do? The colonel answered without hesitation, secure the bridges and crossroads. That is what they want. But even as he spoke, new reports arrived. Bridges had already been seized, roadblocks destroyed, convoys ambushed. The illusion of thousands of paratroopers roaming the countryside was spreading faster than the Germans could respond. Meanwhile, near the artillery position outside Bercourt Manor, Winters gave the signal. The first American rifle cracked. A German sentry collapsed beside the nearest gun. Winters and his men rushed forward through the hedgerow. Grenades exploded among the artillery crews. Within minutes, the small American force captured the first gun, then the second, then the third. What began as a scattered group of paratroopers had just eliminated a German battery that threatened the entire Utah Beach landing. The success would later become one of the most famous small unit actions of the entire war, but at that moment, it was just another piece of chaos unfolding across Normandy. And from the German perspective, the situation was becoming almost surreal. Every road seemed unsafe, every hedgerow might conceal enemy soldiers, every report suggested new airborne landings. Commanders began asking the same question over and over: how many paratroopers had actually landed? The truth was shocking, even the Allies themselves didn't know yet. June 6, 1944. 3:05 hours. Headquarters of the German 91st Air Landing Division, Normandy. Rain began falling again, tapping softly against the roof of the command building. Inside, the operations room had grown tense and crowded. Maps that once looked orderly were now covered in frantic markings, red pencil circles, question marks, arrows pointing in every direction. Major Kurt Reinhardt leaned over the table as another signal arrived from the front. He read the message slowly: enemy paratroopers attacking a supply depot near Neuville-Plain. He rubbed his temples. That makes the sixth engagement in that sector alone. Across the room, Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt spoke quietly. Not 6 units. Reinhardt looked up. Excuse me? Von der Heydt pointed to the map. Possibly 6 small groups. Maybe fewer. The major frowned. You think they are exaggerating? No, the colonel replied. They are frightened. Outside the window, distant gunfire rolled across the countryside. Von der Heydt had seen this before. Airborne warfare was designed to create confusion, small groups attacking everywhere at once, destroying communications, forcing commanders to imagine enemies where none existed. But even he had to admit something was different tonight. The scale was enormous. In the dark hedgerow fields, the scattered American paratroopers were beginning to regroup. Private James Walker and Sergeant Joe Ramirez had joined nearly a dozen men from different units. Some wore the Screaming Eagle patch of the 101st Airborne Division, others belonged to the 82nd Airborne Division. A lieutenant crouched over a map illuminated by a dim flashlight covered with cloth. All right, he whispered. We're somewhere near the Murderette River. Walker wiped mud from his face. How many of us are there supposed to be? The lieutenant gave a quiet laugh. About 13,000 Americans landed tonight. Walker blinked. Then where is everyone? The lieutenant looked around the dark countryside. Probably just as lost as we are. Despite the scattered landings, something remarkable was beginning to happen. Paratroopers who had never met before were forming improvised units. A corporal might suddenly find himself leading 20 men. A lieutenant might command soldiers from 4 different companies, but their objectives were clear: block the roads, capture bridges, slow German reinforcements moving toward the beaches, and across Normandy. These small groups began accomplishing exactly that. Near La Fère Bridge, a critical crossing over the Murderette River, American paratroopers prepared to defend the narrow causeway. If German armored units crossed here, they could strike directly toward Utah Beach. Machine guns were set up behind hedgerows, explosives were placed along the road. Private Walker watched nervously as the men prepared. He turned to Ramirez. "You think they're coming?" Ramirez shrugged. "If I were the Germans, I'd come this way." Walker glanced down the dark road stretching into the distance. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they heard it, engines. Back at the German command post, new reports arrived that seemed even more alarming. A staff officer burst through the door holding a field message. Her Oberst. "Enemy forces have captured the bridge near La Fere." Von der Heydt stared at the map. "That bridge connects the peninsula to the coast." Reinhardt finished the thought. "If they hold it, reinforcements cannot reach the beaches." Another officer spoke nervously. "But how many enemy troops are there?" No one knew. Some reports claimed a battalion, others suggested several hundred. In reality, fewer than 100 American paratroopers held the crossing, yet the uncertainty froze German decision-making. No commander wanted to send troops blindly into what might be a much larger force. The psychological effect of the airborne landings was spreading quickly. German soldiers reported hearing English voices in multiple directions. Gunfire erupted unexpectedly. Roads once considered secure suddenly became ambush zones. At several locations, German units halted their movement entirely, afraid of running into airborne troops. The invasion had not yet even begun on the beaches, but the German rear areas were already unraveling. Near the La Fere causeway, headlights appeared through the darkness. A German convoy approached cautiously. Walker felt his hands trembling slightly as he aimed his rifle. Ramirez whispered, "Wait for it." The trucks rolled closer. German soldiers sat inside, unaware that American paratroopers waited behind the hedgerow only meters away. The lieutenant raised his hand, then dropped it. "Fire." Machine guns roared, rifles cracked, the lead truck burst into flames as bullets tore through the engine. German soldiers leapt from the vehicles, scrambling for cover. The night erupted into chaos. Within minutes the convoy retreated, leaving wrecked vehicles blocking the road. Walker lowered his rifle, breathing hard. He stared at the burning truck lighting the dark countryside. "Think they'll come back?" he asked. Ramirez nodded slowly. "Oh yeah." He looked toward the horizon, where distant flashes of naval artillery were beginning to illuminate the clouds, because the real invasion, he paused, hasn't even started yet. Far away along the Normandy coast, thousands of Allied ships were already approaching the beaches, and German commanders, struggling to understand the airborne chaos behind their lines, were about to face an even greater shock. June 6, 1944. For 30 hours. Normandy coastline near Utah Beach. A pale gray light slowly crept over the horizon. For hours, the fighting inland had taken place in darkness. Brief flashes of gunfire, shouted commands, sudden ambushes in the hedgerows. Now, as dawn approached, the full scale of the operation began to reveal itself. Out at sea, the horizon was filled with ships. Hundreds of silhouettes, destroyers, cruisers, landing craft, formed a vast armada stretching across the channel. Naval guns thundered as shells screamed inland toward German coastal defenses. The ground trembled with each explosion. For the German soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the sight was shocking. What they had feared for months had finally arrived. The invasion. Inside the German headquarters near Corentin, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion to urgency. Major Kurt Reinhardt stood by the map table as artillery boomed in the distance. A communications officer spoke quickly into a telephone. "Yes, we can hear the naval bombardment." "Yes, it has begun." He covered the receiver and looked at Reinhardt. "The coast is under heavy attack." Reinhardt nodded grimly. "We expected that." But what he had not expected was the situation inland. He pointed to the map again. Red markers now filled the countryside. Enemy sightings, destroyed bridges, ambushed convoys, captured crossroads. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt spoke quietly from the edge of the table. The airborne troops were not the main assault. Reinhardt looked at him. They were the door being unlocked. Several kilometers inland, the early morning light revealed the chaotic aftermath of the night's airborne drops. Parachutes hung from trees across fields and orchards. Gliders lay shattered in pastures where British airborne troops had landed during Operation Tonga, the eastern flank of the invasion near the Orne River. Many had crash-landed violently, yet the British had already secured one of their most important objectives, the bridge over the Caen Canal, captured in a daring glider assault that would later be known as Pegasus Bridge. German commanders on that flank were equally stunned. An entire strategic crossing had been seized within minutes of the landings. Near La Fère Causeway, smoke drifted from the burned German convoy destroyed hours earlier. Private James Walker rubbed sleep from his eyes. He had barely rested since landing. Around him, American paratroopers reinforced their defensive positions. More soldiers had arrived during the night, small groups emerging from hedgerows. Muddy and exhausted. A lieutenant checked his watch. Beach landings should start any minute. Walker looked toward the distant coast. He could hear the deep thunder of naval guns. So, we actually did it? Sergeant Joe Ramirez leaned against the hedgerow, lighting a cigarette. We opened the door. Walker frowned. What does that mean? Ramirez exhaled smoke slowly. It means the real fight is coming. And he was right. German forces were beginning to regroup. While the airborne landings had caused confusion, the German army in Normandy was far from defeated. Units from the 709th Infantry Division, the 91st Air Landing Division, and elements of the 352nd Infantry Division began organizing counterattacks. Their orders were clear: destroy the airborne troops, reopen the roads, drive the enemy back toward the sea. But moving those reinforcements was becoming increasingly difficult. Bridges had been blown, roads were blocked by wrecked vehicles, telephone lines were cut across entire sectors, and in many places, German patrols still reported small groups of paratroopers appearing unexpectedly behind them. Back at the German command post, a young signals officer delivered a new message: Herr Oberst, armored units from Carentan are preparing to move toward La Fère. Von der Hayt nodded. That crossing must be retaken. Reinhardt asked the question everyone had been wondering all night: how many enemy troops are holding it? The signals officer hesitated. Our reports vary. Reinhardt frowned. Give me the estimate. The officer swallowed. Between 50 and 500. The room fell silent. Such uncertainty made planning nearly impossible. Von der Hayt finally spoke: send the attack anyway. Meanwhile, across the Norman countryside, the scattered airborne units were slowly transforming into something stronger. More paratroopers found each other, rally points were established, captured German weapons were distributed. Some soldiers had even managed to locate their original officers. Despite landing miles from their planned zones, they were beginning to build a defensive network across the peninsula. Every road the Germans needed was now contested, every movement risked an ambush. The illusion of an airborne army had become reality. Near the causeway, Walker suddenly heard something in the distance, heavy engines. He looked toward Ramirez. You hear that? Ramirez flicked away his cigarette. Oh yeah. A column of German vehicles was approaching through the morning mist, trucks. Half-tracks, and something heavier. Walker squinted down the road. A tank rolled into view. Ramirez muttered under his breath, well, kid. He checked the magazine of his Thompson. Looks like the Germans finally figured out where we are. And the battle for the crossroads of Normandy was about to begin. June 6, 1944. 6:10 hours. La Fère Causeway, Normandy. Morning fog clung to the low fields around the Murderette River, turning the flooded pastures into a pale gray sea. The narrow causeway stretched across the marshland like a thin ribbon of dirt and stone, the only reliable crossing for vehicles in the area. And now it had become one of the most important pieces of ground in Normandy. Private James Walker lay behind a hedgerow beside several other paratroopers. His M1 Garand rested across the dirt, pointed toward the road. The rumble of engines was growing louder. Through the fog, dark shapes began to emerge. German trucks rolled forward cautiously, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry. Behind them, the long barrel of a Panzer IV tank slowly appeared. Walker's stomach tightened. That's a tank, he whispered. Sergeant Joe Ramirez nodded. Sure is. The lieutenant in charge of the American position scanned the road through binoculars. Hold your fire, he said quietly. The men waited. The German column advanced slowly, unaware that dozens of paratroopers were hidden along the hedgerows overlooking the narrow road. The tank rumbled closer. Then the lieutenant lowered the binoculars. Now. The hedgerows exploded with gunfire. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked. Bazooka rockets streaked toward the lead vehicles. The first German truck erupted in flames as the driver lost control, blocking the road behind it. German soldiers jumped from the half-tracks, diving for cover along the edges of the causeway. The Panzer IV turret swung toward the hedgerow. A shell slammed into the earth just meters from Walker, showering him with dirt. Move. Ramirez shouted. The Americans shifted positions quickly, using the thick hedgerows as natural bunkers. Another bazooka team fired. The rocket struck the side of the tank with a sharp metallic crack. Smoke burst from the impact point, but the tank kept moving. Walker's heart hammered in his chest. They're coming through. But the narrow road worked against the German attack. With the lead vehicles burning, the rest of the convoy had little room to maneuver. Trucks were trapped behind one another, making perfect targets. American paratroopers fired from both sides of the causeway. German soldiers attempted to advance on foot, but the open marshland offered little cover. Within minutes, the attack began to falter. The Panzer IV reversed slowly, its crew realizing the road ahead had become a death trap. The column pulled back, leaving burning vehicles scattered across the causeway. Walker lowered his rifle, breathing hard. That's it? Ramirez wiped mud from his helmet. For now. Several kilometers away, German headquarters received the report. Major Kurt Reinhardt read the message in disbelief. Attack repulsed. Heavy resistance at the causeway. Enemy strength unknown. He looked up at Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt. Unknown again. Von der Heydt stared at the map. They are holding the choke points exactly as we feared. Reinhardt shook his head. But how many of them are there? The colonel answered quietly, enough. Across the region, German commanders were encountering the same problem. Every attempt to move reinforcements toward the coast ran into obstacles, destroyed bridges, ambushed convoys, blocked roads. Even small groups of paratroopers could delay entire units for hours, and time was something the Germans could not afford to lose, because along the beaches, the invasion fleet had already begun unloading thousands of soldiers. At Utah Beach, the first waves of American infantry from the 4th Infantry Division were landing under cover of naval artillery. Landing craft slammed against the sand as soldiers rushed onto the beach. Many expected fierce German resistance, but something surprising had happened. Because the airborne troops had disrupted communications and reinforcements overnight, the German coastal defenses were less coordinated than expected. Many units were still trying to understand what was happening inland. The airborne chaos had already begun shaping the battle on the beaches. Meanwhile, in the hedgerow country near St. Mireglise, American paratroopers continued securing villages and crossroads. The town itself had become the first French community liberated during the invasion. German resistance there had collapsed after intense fighting during the night. Civilians cautiously emerged from basements as American soldiers moved through the streets. For them, the war had suddenly arrived, and just as suddenly changed direction. Back at La Fère, Walker watched as smoke drifted from the destroyed vehicles along the road. The fog was lifting now. The morning sun revealed the surrounding countryside in full detail. Fields, hedgerows, flooded marshes, and American paratroopers scattered across all of it. Some were digging foxholes, others were gathering ammunition from abandoned German trucks. Walker looked around. Feels like there's more of us now. Ramirez nodded. Yeah. More airborne soldiers had arrived during the morning, drawn by the sound of fighting and the importance of the crossing. What had begun as a small defensive line was slowly becoming a stronger force, but Ramirez knew something Walker didn't yet realize. The Germans would not give up the causeway easily. It was the key to moving troops across the Cotentin Peninsula, and sooner or later, they would return in greater numbers. June 6, 1944. 9:40 hours. Countryside west of St. Mireglise, Normandy. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away, revealing the true landscape of the Norman bocage. From the air it looked peaceful, green fields separated by thick hedgerows, quiet farms scattered along narrow roads, but on the ground, it had become one of the most dangerous battlefields imaginable. Each field was surrounded by earthen walls 2 meters high, tangled with trees and dense bushes. Roads dipped and curved between them like trenches. You could walk 10 meters and never see beyond the next hedge, and somewhere beyond each one might be enemy soldiers. Private James Walker had never seen terrain like it. He crouched beside Sergeant Joe Ramirez while several paratroopers carefully cut firing positions through the thick vegetation. A lieutenant studied a captured German map. We hold this road, he explained, pointing toward the junction ahead. If they get through here, they can reach the coast. Walker looked down the road. It seemed impossible that this quiet lane could matter so much, but across Normandy, dozens of similar crossroads were now fiercely contested, because every road connected to the beaches, and every road mattered. Inside a farmhouse several kilometers away, German officers were attempting to rebuild order. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt had moved his temporary command post closer to the fighting. Field radios crackled with fragmented reports. An officer read from one of them: enemy troops spotted moving along the road to Chef Dupont. Another report followed seconds later: small enemy force attacking supply vehicles near Amfreville. Then another: enemy patrol firing on rear security near Picoville. The colonel listened silently. The pattern was now clear: small groups, fast attacks, disappearances into the hedgerows. Reinhardt looked up from the map. They are everywhere. Von der Heydt corrected him: they appear to be everywhere. The difference was important, but for the soldiers experiencing these sudden attacks, the effect was exactly the same. No road felt safe. German units attempting to regroup kept encountering unexpected resistance. One company advancing through a field suddenly came under fire from a small group of paratroopers hidden behind a stone wall. Another convoy drove straight into an ambush near a narrow bridge. At one point, a German patrol even reported encountering American soldiers disguised and captured. German helmets. Whether the story was true or not hardly mattered. Rumors spread quickly among tired soldiers already fighting an invisible enemy. Meanwhile, Allied airborne officers were slowly piecing together their scattered forces. Lieutenant Richard Winters, after destroying the artillery battery at Brecourt Manor, was now gathering additional paratroopers. Men appeared from every direction, muddy, exhausted, some missing helmets or equipment. One soldier still carried only a pistol, having lost his rifle during the jump. Winters addressed them calmly: gentlemen, the beach landings are underway. He pointed toward the distant coast. Our job is to keep the Germans from reaching it. The men nodded. Many of them had been fighting continuously since landing hours earlier, but none questioned the mission. Back near La Fère Causeway, the Americans were strengthening their defenses. Private Walker helped drag a captured German MG-34 machine gun into position overlooking the road. Ramirez checked the ammunition belts. German weapons, he muttered. Hope they work. Walker asked, think they'll attack again? Ramirez looked down the causeway. Oh, they will. He kicked one of the burned trucks still blocking part of the road. This place is too important. The causeway remained the only reliable crossing through the flooded marshland. Without it, German units moving from the west could not easily reach the eastern side of the peninsula, and the Americans intended to keep it that way. Around midday, German reconnaissance units finally managed to observe the American defenses. A field report soon reached Colonel von der Heydt. The officer delivering it spoke carefully: Herr Oberst, enemy forces at the causeway appear stronger than expected. Von der Heydt asked the same question again: how many? The officer hesitated: perhaps 200. In reality, fewer than half that number were holding the position, but from a distance, the scattered paratroopers looked like a larger formation. They moved constantly. Different helmets appeared along the hedgerow. Machine guns fired from multiple points. The illusion of strength continued to grow. The colonel studied the map again. If we do not retake that crossing soon, he said quietly, our movement across the peninsula will remain blocked. Reinhardt nodded. We can assemble another attack by this afternoon. Von der Heydt gave the order: prepare a larger force. Back along the American lines, Walker wiped sweat from his face. The morning had passed with only occasional sniper fire and distant explosions, but something in the air had changed. The quiet felt tense. Ramirez looked down the road again. You feel that? He asked. Walker nodded. Yeah. Ramirez loaded a fresh magazine into his Thompson. That means they're coming back. And this time, they would not come with just a few vehicles. June 6, 1944. 14:20 hours. La Fère Causeway, Normandy. By early afternoon the summer sun hung high over the flooded fields of the Murderet River Valley. The morning's fog had vanished, replaced by hot, still air that carried the distant thunder of artillery from the coast. The quiet made the battlefield feel almost peaceful, but every soldier along the American line knew the calm would not last. Private James Walker crouched behind the hedgerow overlooking the causeway. His uniform was soaked with sweat and mud. Across the road, the wreckage from the morning attack still burned slowly. A destroyed truck, a damaged half-track, black smoke drifting upward into the sky. Sergeant Joe Ramirez scanned the horizon through a pair of binoculars, then he lowered them. They're forming up, he said. Walker looked at him. How many this time? Ramirez didn't answer immediately. Finally he said quietly, enough to make things interesting. Nearly a kilometer away, German forces were assembling for another attempt to break through. Infantry from the 1058th Grenadier Regiment of the 91st Air Landing Division gathered along a tree line. Behind them, armored vehicles moved into position. This attack was larger, more coordinated. German officers understood now that the Americans were holding the key crossing, that if they failed again, the entire western side of the Cotentin Peninsula could be cut off from reinforcing the coast. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt had given clear instructions: retake the causeway at any cost. Back at the American position, Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan walked along the hedgerow speaking quietly to his men: conserve ammunition. Let them get close. The paratroopers nodded. Some had been fighting since the night drop with little food or water, but their numbers had grown steadily throughout the day. Small groups of airborne soldiers kept arriving from scattered landing zones. Now the defenders numbered well over 100 men, still not many, but enough to make the Germans pay for every meter of ground. The attack began with mortar fire. German shells whistled overhead and exploded along the hedgerow. Dirt and leaves flew into the air. Walker pressed himself against the earth as fragments tore through the bushes above him. Then the shelling stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then movement appeared across the open fields. German infantry advanced toward the causeway in long lines. Machine guns opened fire. The Americans responded instantly. The hedgerow erupted with rifle shots and automatic fire. Bullets ripped through the grass around the advancing soldiers. Several Germans fell immediately, but others continued forward, using the narrow road and drainage ditches for cover. Walker fired carefully, the recoil of the M1 Garand kicking against his shoulder. The air filled with shouting in both English and German. Then the armored vehicles appeared again. A Panzer IV and several assault guns rolled slowly toward the causeway. Their machine guns sprayed the hedgerow with long bursts. Walker ducked as bullets snapped through the branches above him. Bazooka! Someone shouted. An American team moved into position behind a gap in the hedge. The gunner steadied the weapon, waited, then fired. The rocket streak toward the tank. It struck the front armor and exploded. Smoke burst outward. The tank stopped. For a moment no one knew if it was destroyed. Then the turret slowly turned. The crew was still fighting. The battle intensified. German infantry pushed forward across the open ground, trying to overwhelm the American defenders. At several points they reached the edge of the causeway itself. Hand grenades exploded between the hedgerows. Rifles fired at nearly point-blank range. Walker saw one German soldier leap into the ditch only meters away. Both men raised their rifles at the same moment. Walker fired first. The soldier collapsed. For a second Walker simply stared. Then Ramirez grabbed his shoulder. Stay focused. Despite the pressure, the American line held. Every meter of ground was contested. Machine guns raked the causeway. Bazookas fired again and again at the advancing armor. German officers shouted for their men to push forward, but the narrow road worked against them. Vehicles blocked one another. Infantry were forced to attack across exposed ground. After nearly an hour of fighting, the German assault began to lose momentum. The armored vehicles slowly reversed. Infantry units withdrew toward the tree line. The attack had failed. Again, later that afternoon, the report reached the German command post. Major Kurt Reinhardt read the message silently. Second assault unsuccessful. Heavy resistance. Enemy strength increasing. He set the paper down. Across the room, Colonel von der Heydt looked at the map once more. The beaches, the causeway, the scattered airborne units across the peninsula. He understood now what had happened during the night. The airborne landings had not simply been a surprise. They had been perfectly timed. The Germans had spent the critical early hours of the invasion chasing shadows behind their own lines. And by the time they understood the situation, the beaches were already secure. Back along the American hedgerow, Walker slumped against the dirt wall, exhausted. The afternoon sun hung low over the fields. Smoke drifted above the causeway. Ramirez handed him a canteen. Walker drank greedily. Do you think that was the last attack? He asked. Ramirez wiped sweat from his face and looked down the long road once more. Kid, he said quietly, this place is going to be fought over for days. And in the distance, beyond the hedgerows and flooded fields, thousands more Allied soldiers were already moving inland from the beaches. The airborne troops had done their job, but the battle for Normandy was only beginning. June 7, 1944. Early morning. La Fère Causeway, Normandy. The night had been restless. Even after the second German assault faded into darkness, the American paratroopers along the causeway slept in short, uneasy bursts. The battlefield never fully quieted, occasional rifle shots echoed across the flooded fields, distant artillery thumped along the coast, and every few hours, patrols crept through the hedgerows searching for enemy movement. Private James Walker woke just before dawn, stiff and sore. His uniform was still caked with dried mud from the previous day's fighting. Around him, paratroopers slowly stirred, checking weapons and scanning the road. The burned German vehicles still blocked parts of the causeway, their metal frames twisted by fire. Sergeant Joe Ramirez sat nearby cleaning his Thompson submachine gun. Walker rubbed his eyes. "Feels like we've been here a week." Ramirez chuckled softly. "It's been about 24 hours. Walker looked toward the distant coastline. The morning sky glowed faintly orange. "What's happening on the beaches?" Ramirez shrugged. "From the sound of those guns," he nodded toward the horizon where naval artillery still thundered, "I'd say they're still coming ashore." And they were. During the night and early morning of June 7th, Allied forces continued pouring men and equipment onto Utah Beach. The success of the airborne landings had helped clear critical routes inland. German reinforcements, delayed and confused by the scattered paratroopers, had been unable to mount a coordinated defense during the first crucial hours. Now thousands of infantry, tanks, and supply vehicles were moving inland to link up with the airborne troops, for the men who had landed behind enemy lines in the darkness. Relief was finally approaching, but the Germans were not finished. YET.ATA command post several kilometers away, German officers studied the deteriorating situation. Major Kurt Reinhardt stood beside Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt as new reports arrived. One officer spoke quietly, "Allied infantry advancing inland from Utah Beach." Another added, "Enemy airborne forces consolidating positions near St. Mireglise." Reinhardt exhaled slowly. "They have linked the beaches to their airborne troops." Von der Heydt nodded grimly. "That was their objective all along." He looked down at the map again, the scattered red markers representing airborne sightings from the previous night now connected like a web. Roads, bridges, crossroads, each one had been targeted by paratroopers. It was suddenly clear how the Allies had done it. They had not needed perfect landings, they had only needed enough men to disrupt the German rear areas. And the confusion created during those first hours had been devastating. Meanwhile, American patrols near La Fere began reporting movement to the east. At first the paratroopers feared another German attack. Walker and Ramirez quickly took positions along the hedgerow, but the approaching figures carried unfamiliar equipment, steel helmets with camouflage netting, long columns of infantry moving cautiously along the road. Then someone shouted from down the line, "Friendly! Friendly!" The first soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division had arrived from Utah Beach. Walker stood up slowly, hardly believing it. Dusty infantrymen marched toward the causeway, many carrying heavy packs and rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them grinned at the muddy paratroopers. "You guys been holding this place alone?" Ramirez laughed, "More or less." The infantryman looked at the wreckage along the road. "Looks like you had a busy night." Walker felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. For the first time since he had jumped into the darkness nearly 30 hours earlier, the front line finally felt connected. The airborne troops were no longer isolated. As more Allied units moved through the area, the scale of the invasion became clear. Columns of trucks, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles rolled inland. Engineers began clearing obstacles and repairing damaged roads. The causeway at La Fere, once defended by scattered paratroopers in the darkness, had become a vital gateway linking the beachhead to the interior of Normandy. That afternoon, Colonel von der Heydt received confirmation that German counterattacks near the crossing had failed. He stared silently at the report. The opportunity to push the airborne troops back into the sea had passed. The Allies had secured their foothold. What had begun with thousands of paratroopers descending through the night had now grown into a massive invasion force spreading across the peninsula. The door into Normandy was open, and it would not close again. Back at the hedgerow, Walker watched another convoy of Allied vehicles rumble past. He looked at Ramirez. "So, we did it?" Ramirez shrugged modestly. "We helped." Walker nodded slowly. He thought back to the moment he had jumped from the aircraft into the dark sky, unsure where he would land. Back then the countryside had felt enormous and empty. Now it was filled with Allied soldiers moving forward. But even as the battle line advanced inland, one thing remained certain: the night when German commanders suddenly discovered paratroopers appearing behind their lines had changed the entire course of the invasion. June 8, 1944. Normandy, France, the smoke of battle still hung over the countryside. 2 days after the first parachutes had drifted down through the darkness, the Norman fields looked very different. Where quiet farms and hedgerows had once stood undisturbed, now there were trenches, burned vehicles, shattered gliders, and the constant movement of soldiers and supplies. Columns of Allied trucks rolled along narrow country roads, artillery batteries were being set into position, and across the sky, Allied fighter aircraft circled almost continuously. The invasion was no longer a fragile foothold. It had become a growing front. Private James Walker stood beside the road near Saint-Mir-Église. Watching the endless stream of vehicles passing by, tanks from American armored divisions clattered past, supply trucks carried ammunition, fuel, and rations inland, medics transported wounded soldiers back toward the beach. Walker leaned on his rifle, barely recognizing the landscape he had parachuted into only 2 nights earlier. The quiet French countryside had turned into a highway of war. Sergeant Joe Ramirez stepped up beside him. "You look like you're thinking too hard," Ramirez said. Walker nodded toward the passing vehicles, just trying to imagine what the Germans must have thought that night. Ramirez smiled faintly. "Probably the same thing we did." "What's that?" "That the whole world just dropped out of the sky." For the German commanders in Normandy, the events of June 6, 1944, had indeed felt like that. Throughout the night and early morning hours, reports had flooded in from every direction. Enemy paratroopers here, enemy patrols there, bridges destroyed, convoys ambushed, communications cut. Officers trying to control the battlefield. It seemed as though Allied troops had appeared everywhere at once. But the truth was more complex. The airborne drops had been scattered across miles of countryside by clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and navigational errors. Entire units had landed far from their intended targets. Some paratroopers had fought in groups of only 3 or 4 men, others had wandered for hours before finding fellow soldiers. Yet this chaos had created an unexpected advantage. Small groups moving independently had attacked roads, bridges, and communication lines across a wide area. To the Germans, the scattered landings looked like a massive airborne army. The illusion slowed decision making at the most critical moment, and those lost hours allowed the amphibious landings to succeed. Military historians would later study the airborne operations of that night in great detail. More than 20,000 Allied airborne troops had been dropped into Normandy during the first hours of the invasion. American divisions, the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne, had landed on the western flank near Utah Beach. British airborne forces had landed to the east near the Orne River. Their missions had been dangerous and precise: capture bridges, block reinforcements, create confusion behind German lines. Despite heavy casualties and scattered landings, those missions were largely successful. Key roads were blocked, important crossings were seized, and German counterattacks toward the beaches were delayed. Near the church in Saint-Mir-Église, Walker and Ramirez paused as they passed the square. The town was slowly returning to life. French civilians had begun emerging from hiding, cautiously greeting the American soldiers who now filled the streets. A group of children stared wide-eyed at the paratroopers. One small boy pointed to Walker's helmet. "You came from the sky?" Walker smiled. "Something like that." A short distance away, the church steeple still bore silent witness to the night's events. It was there that Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been caught when his parachute snagged on the tower during the drop. He had hung there for hours, pretending to be dead while German soldiers searched below. Stories like his had already begun spreading among the troops. Stories of men landing in flooded fields. Of soldiers fighting in darkness with strangers who quickly became comrades. Of tiny groups of paratroopers holding crossroads that entire battalions later marched through. Walker looked around the busy streets of the liberated town. It was hard to believe that only days earlier, German forces had controlled every road here. The invasion had changed everything, and it had begun with a moment of shock. German commanders realizing that enemy soldiers were suddenly behind their lines. Ramirez glanced toward the west where the front lines were slowly pushing inland. "Well," he said, adjusting the strap of his weapon, "looks like we're moving again." Walker nodded. The battle for Normandy was far from over, but one thing was certain: the night when thousands of paratroopers fell silently from the sky had shattered the German defenses at the very moment they needed clarity most. It was a night of confusion, courage, and chaos. A night when scattered soldiers turned uncertainty into opportunity. and a night that helped open the road to the liberation of Western Europe.